Welcome to Lesson 5 of this series on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're going to be studying Matthew chapter 6 verses 1 through 21, and we'll be talking about reward in the kingdom. So let's go ahead and start with verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Now this passage has a pretty obvious main point that's repeated again and again. In fact, Jesus is using a specific pattern for his teaching. And this verse 1 serves as kind of an introduction to the entire passage where he just lays out the main point, that he's talking about really your practice of righteousness. Now, he's comparing, there are some people who practice their righteousness before other people, and they do it in order to be seen by them. And the result is that they will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So Jesus makes this contrast between practicing righteousness in front of other people and those who practice their righteousness really for the Father who is in heaven. And the result is that those who practice their righteousness in front of people, they receive no reward. While those who practice their righteousness before the Father sees their acts of righteousness and he gives them a reward. Now, Jesus has made this point clear in verse 1, so he could have just stopped the teaching right there. Instead, he goes on with multiple examples, in fact, 3 times, repeating this same pattern, talking about the reward of the kingdom as it applies to 3 different cases. So let's go ahead and look at Jesus' first case in verses 2 through 4. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, in this first case, Jesus is talking about giving to the needy. And so we can just summarize this in general as the case of charity. Now, today you might give to your church or some organization or give to the poor. But in general, Jesus' point is that when you give, don't give like the hypocrites do. But contrasting, so Jesus makes this contrast between what the hypocrites do and what you should be doing. So in each of these 3 cases, Jesus lays out the wrong forms of righteousness that the hypocrites engage in, and he compares that with the right forms of righteousness that you should be practicing. Now, we've already heard Jesus talking about the hypocrites back in lesson 2. Specifically, when we studied Matthew chapter 5, he said in verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, in that verse, Jesus didn't specifically use the word hypocrite, but we saw in lesson 2 how Jesus often referred to the scribes and the Pharisees and also other religious leaders as hypocrites for the way that they appeared righteous on the outside, but they were actually selfish and unloving on the inside. So here in this passage, the Pharisees and the scribes and other religious leaders, they had this practice of announcing their righteousness, like as if they are sounding it out with trumpets. And so they would do their works of charity and give to the needy by standing in the synagogue and announcing it in the streets. Basically, they were doing their righteousness in public. And the purpose of it was to be praised by others. Their focus was to receive that praise. And then Jesus emphasizes the result, and he does it with this specific phrase, truly I say to you. And in all 3 cases, he repeats this pattern, that he uses this phrase, truly I say to you, to emphasize. So I'm going to just use a short form in the notes and just write truly. And what he says is that they have received their reward. Basically, because they're doing their works of righteousness in public in order to get the praise of the people, they have no reward. And so Then Jesus goes on to the second half of the comparison of what the right forms of righteousness are, what you should be doing. And so he uses this expression, but when you. Just as in 3 cases, he's going to use this expression, truly I say to you, for the hypocrites. For the right forms of righteousness that you're supposed to do, he uses this phrase, but when you. And so I'm going to summarize this in a short form. I'll just say, but you. But you, the right things that you should be doing, when you give, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And so basically he's saying, when you give in secret. And giving in secret is a contrast with what the hypocrites do of giving in, standing in the streets in the synagogue, publicly showing off their giving, because they are giving for the sake of the Father, instead of what the hypocrites do, for their giving for the sake of others, in this contrast. And so the result is the Father will see what they're doing and give them a reward, as opposed to the hypocrites that they receive no reward. Okay, so, but when you give in secret for the sake of the Father will see your works in secret, and he will reward you. The main point of this first case then is very obvious, that we are supposed to give in our forms of charity, give before God and God alone, not people. Don't give and do our works of charity before people. And the result will be is that if we give before God, that God will reward us. So in terms of application then, now, while Jesus is specifically talking about these forms of charity, we can more generalize it in our acts of service. In general, when you serve and do good things for others, whether it's giving your money or giving your time or other types of help, do you do it for the sake of God or do you do it for the sake of others? And so one question that you can ask yourself is, who do you serve? When you give or serve or otherwise help people, is it the people within your own circle of friends and family? Do you serve only the people who can recognize your service and give you praise for it? Do you serve people who can build up your reputation as a kind and generous person? Or are there any times that you have served people who don't give you any recognition for your service? Think about strangers who are not part of your group of friends and can never pay you back. What would it look like to give anonymously or serve anonymously? Or have you ever served people who are not thankful for what you've done and don't praise you for it? Think about service to children. Often this is like this. Or sometimes service to the poor is like this. Sometimes even service to your own family is like this. That if you're kind and generous to your own family, it doesn't build up your reputation among your friends. So often that becomes your last priority. So there can be this tendency to be kind and generous to your friends and your colleagues, but actually harsh and stingy to your own family. But if we're truly serving for the sake of our Father in heaven, we would serve all people and give generously even to those who don't boost our reputation. So think about these things as an application. What are some ways that you can serve those who don't praise you and who don't give you any reward in return? Now let's go on to verses 5 and 6. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, in this second case, Jesus is talking about prayer. And so for this case of prayer, again, Jesus makes this contrast between the hypocrites and you, saying the bad and the wrong forms of righteousness that the hypocrites engage in, as a contrast to the right forms of righteousness that you should be engaging in. And so the hypocrites, they love to stand in the synagogue and on the street corners. That is, they pray in public. And the purpose is to be seen by others. So that's where their reward comes from. And Jesus emphasizes that point again with this phrase, truly I say to you, that they have received their reward. So basically they have no reward. But when you, Jesus using this phrase to emphasize the right forms of righteousness that you should be engaged in, you are supposed to go into your room and shut the door. So you're praying in private. The contrast with the hypocrites who pray in public, because you're praying for the sake of the Father, not like the hypocrites who pray for the sake of others. And the Father who sees in secret will reward you, as opposed to the no reward that the hypocrites receive. And just like in the first case, Jesus' main point is pretty simple, that we are supposed to pray before God and not before people. And the result will be is that God will see and hear our prayer, and he will reward us. Now, in terms of application, I want to broaden this category of prayer that Jesus is talking about to include the general forms of worship that we engage in. So in terms of application, ask yourself the question, do you worship in private? In this very busy world, we have many activities and we do much work, but we spend all of our time and effort on work that we think will produce something. But what does prayer and worship produce? A lot of times we don't pray or worship privately because we don't really believe that it'll do anything. We don't really believe that this invisible and spiritual activity would have any impact on our physical world. So we only pray and worship in public, where we gain some benefit, at least in front of other people. Now, of course, we still do need to have group worship and group prayer, but as an application, I want you to challenge yourself to make those times of private prayer and worship too. When you do it in secret, you know that you're doing it only before the Father and only for his sake, and not for other people's sake or the people's reward. And so God will certainly hear your prayer and receive your worship. Now, at this point in the passage, if we look at the big picture, we can see that starting in verse 7, there is a break in the pattern. That Jesus stops talking about the hypocrites, and here he starts to mention the Gentiles. And then he teaches what is known as the Lord's Prayer. And then Jesus picks up in verse 16, and it seems like the pattern continues. Because again, Jesus starts to talk about the hypocrites instead of the Gentiles. So in the next lesson, I'm going to focus on this section of verses 7 through 15 and study this important topic of prayer, specifically using the Lord's Prayer as a model for our practice of prayer. But for this lesson, I'm going to skip that section and just continue with Jesus' third case as he talks about fasting. So as our third example of our practice of righteousness, fasting, let's read verses 16 through 18. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So again, Jesus contrasts the hypocrites with you, saying all the things that the hypocrites are doing wrong in their practice of righteousness compared to you and what you are supposed to be doing in your practice of righteousness. So the hypocrites, they disfigure their faces so that they may be seen by others. Basically, they're being very showy in their righteousness because their reward is that they want to be seen by others. They want to get that praise from others. And so Jesus says, truly I say to you, again, he emphasizes with this same phrase, truly, that they have received their reward. They receive no reward. Now, by contrast, but you, this is the righteousness you should be doing when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, basically be normal. Don't be showy, but just go about and don't let anyone see your discomfort or your sacrifice, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. So instead of fasting for the sake of others, they are fasting for the sake of their Father in heaven. And unlike the hypocrites who receive no reward, their Father will see their behavior and reward them. So they fast before the Father, and the Father rewards. Now you can see that the pattern is so clear. It's almost an exact repetition of the examples on charity and prayer. So Jesus' main point is very simple again. Fast before God, not people, and then the result will be that God rewards you. So for the application as well, Jesus is talking about the specific case of fasting, but I want to talk more in general about the issue of sacrifice. Fasting is an act of causing yourself to suffer for the sake of worship and prayer and your devotion to God. So just as Jesus has instructed us, we should have regular times of fasting and prayer. And it's important to note that while Jesus teaches us that we should fast, he does not specify how we should fast. He doesn't give us specific directions on how long or how many meals or what to eat or not eat. But the general principle of fasting is that we're sacrificing something that may be inconvenient or uncomfortable, and we're doing it for God's sake. Fasting generally refers to sacrificing food, but I want to think about our application to include other types of sacrifice, like giving up of your time to help someone, or giving up your comfort to serve in a needy country somewhere, or giving up your status in order to help those who are disadvantaged, or whatever it may be. And when you do those things, do you make sure that the whole world knows how much you're suffering and how much you have sacrificed? Can you go a whole day without eating and not tell a single person about it? Can you sacrifice your time at a homeless shelter and no one know about it? Can you humble yourself to serve those who are poor and needy and not be recognized for it? Of course, there are times when we need to work with other people and organizations in order to make our sacrifice more effective. But in your heart motivation, are you sacrificing before God or before people? Now that we've seen all the details of these three cases, we can see clearly the pattern that Jesus uses and repeats these 3 times. And we can ask the question of, why does Jesus repeat the pattern 3 times? Now, whenever you see a pattern or repetition, there's probably a really good reason for it. So I want to look again at this pattern and think about what was Jesus' reason for it. Now, in previous lessons, I've talked about this idea of painting a picture. When Jesus teaches a topic with several individual points, it's not only important to understand the points and the details of it, but we can see that these individual brushstrokes are part of an overall picture that Jesus is painting. So when we take a step back and look at the overall view of this picture, we can see that there's general issues of righteousness. And in this case, Jesus taught all these examples such as charity and prayer and fasting. And we can generalize those issues in things like service and worship and sacrifice. Jesus' point then is to do all these acts of righteousness for the sake of God and not for the sake of other people. And when Jesus lists these areas of activities like this, it's not like he's talking only about these 3 areas of activity. Again, these are like 3 brushstrokes. Jesus is painting a picture of our entire life for God. So you can think of these 3 points as just 3 examples of all of our kingdom activities. Jesus has been talking about this kingdom of heaven from the beginning. So how do you know if your activities are for the kingdom or not? Now, so far, Jesus has taught a lot of things about the kingdom activities from the beginning of this Sermon on the Mount. Even from the beginning, he was talking about issues of character, of being meek, of being poor in spirit and hungering for righteousness. He's also taught us that the kingdom activity is not just outward behavior, like not murdering and not committing adultery, but also a matter of our internal righteousness, of not even being angry or not lusting. He's also taught us that the kingdom is also about love, not only loving our brothers and our friends, but even loving our enemies. And now he's teaching us that the kingdom is also about your audience. Who are you performing these acts of righteousness for? Are you living for God or are you living for other people? Now, what does all this have to do with us? The fact that Jesus has to give us 3 examples with the same pattern shows us that this must be a really significant problem. Even after 3 examples, most of us can still think to ourselves, I get it, but that's not my problem. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not living just for the opinion of others. But if Jesus is making the same point with 3 almost identical cases in this pattern again and again, we can just assume that this is my problem as well. We should just assume that we do care way too much about what other people think of us. And even when we do things that are supposed to be for God and his kingdom, in our hearts, we're really doing them for other people. And because it's so hard to see and admit this point for ourselves, Jesus has to teach it 3 times. Now, I'm sure you know what this is like. When someone praises you for something good that you've done, you say you don't need the recognition. You say that it's all for the glory of God. But think about the feeling that you get. That inside your heart, it feels good, doesn't it? And when you do something good and no one acknowledges it, it's so hard to let that go. In fact, in your heart, it can feel like some crime has been committed. Maybe you would get this feeling of being hurt, or even a feeling of anger. And it's those feelings that reveal who your true audience is. And that's another reason why audience is so important, to reveal our kingdom activities. Because if we do our kingdom activities for people instead of God, we end up tearing the kingdom apart. Maybe you've been in a religious community that you've experienced where people get angry at each other and start fighting each other. And eventually the religious community just splits apart. Now, many times, it's not because they have done something wrong, but because they've done something right and have not received the recognition for it. When people are working for the reward, they'll naturally get very upset when they don't receive it. And in their anger, they tear the kingdom apart. So unless our kingdom activity is done only for our Father in heaven, then our activities don't end up building that kingdom. Now let's go ahead and look at this last section of our passage. And here, Jesus gives us really a conclusion to his teaching here in verses 19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. And for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now it's interesting that after 7 times of using this word reward in the passage, now in the conclusion, he switches to the word treasure. And in fact, 3 times he repeats this word treasure. When I think of reward, there's the sense that it's something valuable that I receive as a result of some sort of personal achievement or some sort of good work. But when I think of treasure, the focus is more on just the value of the thing itself, regardless of where it came from or how you got it. Now, Jesus describes this treasure in terms of where you store it up. For some people, they store up this treasure on earth. For others, they store up this treasure in heaven. For the treasure on earth, Jesus says that there's moth and rust and thieves. Basically, this treasure will be destroyed. But for the treasure laid up in heaven, there's no moth, there's no rust, there's no thieves. Basically, this treasure will be eternal. Now, Jesus could have just ended the passage right there, and it would have been consistent with all the three examples of do your acts of righteousness for God's sake, and he will reward you with treasures in heaven. But then Jesus adds this very last point in verse 21. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So your heart as well will either be focused on earth and be destroyed, or invested in heaven and be eternal. Now, we often think of the heart as the root of our emotions, but in the Bible, the heart is the center of our personality, which includes our emotions, but also our mind and our will. So for our heart to be in heaven means that it's the center of all of our focus and the things that we desire. And to have that focus and desire rooted in the kingdom of heaven, not in the kingdom of this world. So we need to turn the attention of our hearts. We need to redirect the affection and desire of our hearts away from these worthless and temporary treasures to the true and eternal treasure that we have in heaven. And so how do we do that? The thing that really moves our hearts and redirects our desires is the gospel of Jesus. And so we always end our study with this last step of the Jesus factor. This intentional step of looking at the passage again to see how it relates to the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection on our behalf. And so one way to think about the application of the gospel in a passage is to ask the question, did the rule apply to Jesus? That is, Jesus' teaching is so clear. Give in secret and God will reward you. Pray in secret and God will reward you. Fast in secret and God will reward you. But did that rule apply to Jesus as well? He did so many acts of righteousness in public and in secret. So think about it. What was Jesus' reward? In the first case, Jesus certainly did a lot of charity and he did a lot of service, specifically caring for those who are needy. For example, there were public acts of charity like feeding the 5,000, but there were also private ones too, like the raising of Jairus' daughter. Raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead in Mark chapter 5, in which he strictly told them not to tell anyone. There was also the example of healing the leper in Mathew chapter 8, in which again he told the man not to tell anyone. But what was his reward? The more he healed and served and helped people, the angrier the religious leaders got. They were angry because they wanted the praise from the people, and Jesus was stealing their reward. But Jesus kept healing and serving the people until finally his reward was that the religious leaders put him to death on the cross. And what about the example of prayer and of worship? Certainly there were plenty of examples when Jesus was engaging in prayer privately with only his Father in heaven. And one of the greatest examples of this was at the Garden of Gethsemane, in which he prayed 3 times to the Father that this cup of judgment would be taken away from him. Basically, he was praying that he would be saved from all of the punishment and suffering that he would endure on the cross. But even in this most sincere prayer in secret, he still had to go to the cross. And then there's the case of fasting and sacrifice. And in Jesus's, all the times that he fasted and prayed, there is one example in particular of fasting that really stands out. It was the time that Jesus fasted for 40 days, all by himself in the wilderness when he was tested by Satan. And what was Jesus' reward for 40 days of fasting in secret? At the end of the passage, Jesus passed the test and he didn't fall into the devil's temptations. but it says that the devil left him for another opportune time. Now, many theologians think that that opportune time was when Satan would again test Jesus, and specifically at the cross. The cross was the final test of Satan trying to tempt Jesus into sinning. Jesus faithfully served before the Father. He privately prayed before the Father. He fasted before the Father, and yet his reward was his own suffering and death on the cross. When we think about Jesus' reward as the cross, it gives us some insight into the reason why he changed the word in the conclusion from the passage to reward to this word treasure. Because while the cross might have been the thing that he received for his actions, that was his reward, it was certainly not the thing that was of greatest value to him. His desire and his focus, it was not his treasure. And so what was Jesus' treasure? What was the thing that was in his heart and what he was most focused on, most desiring? His ultimate treasure was you. You were his focus and his desire. You were his heart that allowed him to endure the cross. Now think of all the times that you've failed to serve and failed to worship and failed to sacrifice for our Father in heaven. Think of all the times that you and I behave like hypocrites, doing our acts of righteousness before the world, desiring our reward from other people. When you think of all those times that you've lived like the hypocrites, realize that the only reward that you deserve is the judgment of the Father. And yet Jesus has taken all that judgment upon himself on the cross. And he's done that because you are his treasure. And by faith in him, Jesus saves you from all that judgment and you become his reward. Isn't it interesting that in all of Jesus' teaching about our reward from the Father and our treasure in heaven, not once does Jesus tell us what our reward actually is? So we can ask ourselves this question: what is your treasure? What is your treasure that you've stored up in heaven for all of eternity? I believe that just as Jesus' treasure stored up in heaven for all of eternity is you, in the same way, our treasure for all of eternity in heaven is Jesus. He will be our treasure if he is where our heart is. And if Jesus is truly your treasure, who cares what other people think of you? Who cares whether or not they praise you? If Jesus is your treasure and he has given you his life on the cross, then there is no greater treasure that you would ever need.